of this gospel. And I've taken the reading from the Message, the New Testament in contemporary language. The good news of Jesus Christ, the message, begins here, following to the letter the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Watch closely, I'm sending my preacher ahead of you. He'll make the road smooth for you. Thunder in the desert. Prepare for God's arrival. Make the road smooth and straight. John the Baptizer appeared in the wild, preaching a baptism of life change that leads to forgiveness of sins. People thronged to him from Judea and Jerusalem, and as they confessed their sins, were baptized by him in the Jordan River into a changed life. John wore a camel hair habit, tied at the waist with a leather belt. He ate locusts and wild field honey. As he preached, he said, "The real action comes next. The star in this drama, to whom I'm a mere stagehand, will change your life. I'm baptizing you here in the river, turning your old life into a kingdom life. His baptism, a holy baptism by the Holy Spirit, will change you from the inside out." At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came up out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit, looking like a dove, come down on him. Along with the Spirit, a voice. "You are my Son, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life." Immediately, this same Spirit pushed Jesus out into the wild. For 40 wilderness days and nights, he was tested by Satan. Wild animals were his companions, and angels took care of him. It's the word of God for the people of God. The author of Mark's gospel doesn't mess around. He gets right to the point. In this gospel, we see the word immediately used time and time again. Actually, 27 times. Something happens and immediately something else happens. And if we look more closely at the scripture reading for today, we see where immediately is used for the first time. The Spirit immediately drove Jesus into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness for 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with wild beasts, and angels waited on him. It's Mark 1, verses 12 and 13. The 40 days of Lent, in part, remind us of the 40 days Jesus spent in the wilderness. Jesus is driven there by the Holy Spirit immediately after he receives God's blessing and before he begins his work in the world. That word immediately suggests that perhaps this was against Jesus' will. He was pushed, he was driven into the wilderness. After all, who wants to go into the wilderness willingly? While there, he encounters several temptations. He also sits with the wild beasts and is nurtured by angels. For 2 short verses, there's a lot going on in this passage. Author Sarah Parsons remembers a time of wilderness in her life. She'd been a star in her hometown school. And she went off to college and discovered that there were many stars from many high schools. She set out to work to show everyone that she was still a star. By the end of her first semester, she was exhausted from trying to excel. She said she didn't choose to enter a wilderness of depression, yet she was led into one that year. Looking back, she can see that she needed the wilderness to move from one identity into another, from the identity of a high school superstar to another, fuller, truer identity. To get there, she had to go through a period of great loss and confusion. Although the process was painful and sometimes frightening, she became freer to be herself. I believe we all experience our own wilderness in life. I think in my own life, moving from Topeka to Salina, Kansas was a great loss. I felt like I was moving to a small town. I cried when I saw the green elevators as we drove into town. I learned a lot about myself living in Salina, Kansas. I remember going through the wilderness of my mother's dying and her death, and how my life changed not having a mother any longer at 36 years of age. I've talked about my husband's leaving. I went off to seminary. I left a secure community in Salina, Kansas to go out into the wilderness of seminary. I didn't know what to expect when I got there. And even moving to Prairie, Kansas has offered an opportunity to be in the wilderness. In our culture, we tend to resist the wilderness. We want to avoid emotional pain and unhappiness. Our world is full of smiling faces, celebrating wealth and recreation as the good life. Being human, though, means living a life of ups and downs and experiencing a full range of emotions, from great joy to great sorrow. To resist sorrow, pain, anxiety, and confusion is tantamount to refusing to be human, and we lose many rich experiences and closeness to God when we refuse to be fully ourselves. I invite you right now to take a moment to think of a time when you felt like you were in a wilderness. And again, whoever chooses to be in a wilderness. Maybe you were or are driven into a wilderness now through a death, a loss, a change of life status. Is it possible to open yourself up to the chaos that's inside, a chaos that's already there? We don't have to pretend that we don't want to go there. We can go kicking and screaming into the wilderness. If we're able to open ourselves to the possibility that some chaos, some wild energy lives within us, God will show us how to find it and how to be in it. God may show us parts of ourselves that we don't want to see. God also offers comfort and shows us the truth, a truth that can move us into a new place, a new identity, with new energy, new freedom, and a new sense of humility. The 40 days of Lent offers time to examine where we've been and where we want to go in our spiritual lives. We don't have to make any snap decisions. It's a time of being in between as we sit between one place and the next. It's a time of dropping our old ways of doing things and not knowing for sure what the new ways of being will look like. And this can be uncomfortable, even scary for some people. Not to live in this in-between time would be denying ourselves an opportunity for spiritual growth, a spiritual adventure even, found in that in-between time. We don't like the wilderness. We don't want to go to the wilderness. I don't want to be in the wilderness. And yet God is very present in that wilderness time, that in-between time. One of our greatest temptations is to be like God. We humans attempt divinity by attempting to take complete control. Any controllers in this room? Don't raise your hand. We orchestrate our lives and maybe the lives of others as if we are puppet masters playing out events we deem best. My daughter loves to plan things out in the minutest of details. She's a list maker, and she loves making lists. She did this with her wedding, pretty much without her mom's assistance. I was in seminary in the Chicago area, and I wasn't there to help pick the dress, to choose the colors, to decide on a cake, to support her in all of her decisions except by phone. We didn't have cell phone cameras where you could take pictures and send them off even. I wasn't much help at all. I did manage to get to protection about a week before the wedding. The afternoon before the wedding, we had lunch together in protection and then drove separately over to Coldwater to finish decorating the VFW hall. Only I didn't make it. I rolled my 13-year-old VW convertible 3 times off a gravel road and ended up in the hospital for observation overnight. Let me tell you, there were no broken bones, there was no blood. I did wear a neck brace and had a splint on my finger, but I was just in the hospital overnight for observation. I had been invited to do the message for the wedding service. Kurt and Andy decided to have their pastor perform the actual ceremony, but I got to do the message. And I had written it 9 months earlier, and I had been practicing it for 6 months, even used it as a class project for my preaching class. I practiced it, and I practiced it until I had it down pat. The day of the wedding, though, I wasn't able to go forward and stand with the pastor. The couple and the pastor were up here, and I was sitting in a front pew over on the side, and I didn't know if I could walk the distance by myself, and there wasn't a pulpit, so the couple came over to me. And everybody in the sanctuary knew, it was a small town, knew that I'd rolled the car the day before. And there was nary a dry eye in the place as I gave the wedding message that day. I had friends on either side of me to help me stand up, and they were there to help if I had any trouble at all. I remember asking Andy at the reception if the wedding was all that she had expected and hoped for. I had remembered hearing that expectations are premeditated resentments. If our expectations aren't met, that we can feel resentful. So I asked her, was it all that you expected and hoped for? And she said, just that you were here made it perfect.
Aww.
She'd been tempted to create the perfect wedding all by herself. It didn't happen just the way she planned and intended, and yet it was perfect in her eyes in the end, just the way it was. Well, we know that Jesus was tempted in the wilderness. His temptations fall along the same lines, those of taking control and planning events without God's help. First, Jesus is tempted to turn stones into bread. Surely he wanted that. He must have been hungry. But no, he didn't take control. Second, he was tempted to defy the laws of gravity, even to defy death itself by throwing himself off the pinnacle of the temple. But no, he didn't try to play God. And in the third temptation, Jesus is offered all the worldly power he could want if he would only bow down and worship Satan. But no, he didn't turn away from God. These three temptations were chances to be like God. Jesus is tempted to gratify all his own desires, to defy his physical limitations, to take charge of the world, all capabilities unnatural to human beings. I want to stop here just a moment and let you know, if you haven't heard before, that in the Aramaic language, the language that Jesus spoke, the word Satan means crazy thoughts. Think about that. Crazy thoughts. Many people have struggled all their lives in the church with the idea that there is some power outside forcing them to do things that they don't want to do. And where is the personal responsibility in that? Thinking or believing, like the comedian Flip Wilson says, the devil made me do it, gives my personal power away. What if, just what if, something to think about, what if the temptations of Jesus were his own crazy thoughts in the moment? I just invite you to think about that possibility as you think about the temptations of Jesus. I invite you to read them over yourself this week with that thought in mind. Satan means crazy thoughts in Aramaic. It gives us a whole different perspective on what we're reading. As we watch out for our own temptations this Lenten season, it would be good for us to be aware of our own crazy thoughts, about what we think we can control and manipulate. We might want to make someone love us, or make our work follow a certain course, or control someone else's life because, of course, we know what's best. These temptations are the very stuff of the wilderness time. Yielding to our crazy thoughts leads to more chaos in our lives. I believe it's possible for us to be aware of and to name our temptations, our crazy thoughts, and to be deeply honest with ourselves about them. During Lent, I invite you and me as well to listen for our temptations and hear what they ask of us. Naming them doesn't mean yielding to them or resisting them. It just means being aware of them, being aware of what's going on inside. For now, we can just accept that temptations are present and a part of this wilderness place we're entering. Temptations are real. They're real. The gospel passage also tells us that Jesus was with the wild beasts. As far as we can tell, he sat quietly with them. I think about my sister several years ago heading to Africa. She was interested in and yet fearful of being among the wild beasts. I have a friend, Brian, in Wichita, who also took an African safari. And Brian quit drinking water or anything about 3 o'clock in the afternoon because one night he had to get up in the middle of the night to use the facilities, which was the trees or the bush or whatever was out there. And he ran into a wild hog, and it terrified him. So he quit drinking water. We have a tendency to want to get rid of the wild beasts like Brian did. They're dangerous. They can be dangerous sometimes. When we enter the wilderness of our own lives, the inner wilderness of our own lives, we will find wild beasts. They are simply parts of ourselves and our world that we cannot control. Emotions arise within us at times and feel like untamable wild beasts. Fear, anger, rage, confusion, frustration. We often feel threatened by these emotions when more often than not they really mean us no harm. They want to tell us something. They want to teach us something. When I was out at the retreat center, I had a friend from El Dorado, Mary Jo Grant, who was a therapist, and she came out and led a workshop on dream work. And there was a doctor, a woman from Salina, who came down for this workshop. She had a recurring nightmare that really frightened her. And Mary Jo, because of her work with dreams, realized that our dreams are often the Spirit talking to us at night. I don't know if you've ever kept track of dreams that you've had, especially those that are very vivid and vibrant. But often it's the Spirit trying to get through to us, to tell us something. Maybe we have information that comes to us through the day and we ignore it. So at night the Spirit works. And if we don't listen, the Spirit ratchets up the intensity through nightmares. And as this doctor worked through her nightmare with Mary Jo, she realized that it was a message from God, a message from the Spirit. And it gave her a sense of peace when she realized what it was all about, and it didn't have to be something that she was frightened of. I also want to tell you about a woman named Kathy who did a soul collage card. Out of the retreat center, soul collage cards were 5x8 cards that we created through images from magazines, and they were created intuitively, and they represented those inner voices within us. Maybe the jokester, the manipulator, the organizer, the inner critic. Kathy made an inner critic card, and when she got finished, she burst out laughing. On this card were heads of women that looked just angry and scornful and whatever words, they were just mean ladies, pointy fingers and hair in curlers and scowling faces. And she burst out laughing because she said, "This is what I've been afraid of all these years." She listened to that inner voice within her that was telling her that her inner critic didn't have to be something or someone she needed to be afraid of. Actually, I've learned in my own life that the inner critic comes to us when we're little. It's the voices of our parents, our pastors, our teachers, our caregivers. As we try to fit into the adult world and be good kids, And this voice, when we get older, will still say, don't do that, or who do you think you are? How do you think you can, why do you think you can do that? And I learned to make peace with my inner critic by saying, thank you. Thank you for saving my life all those years ago by teaching me how to live with the adult world. But I'm the adult now, and I can take care of myself as an adult, and I can take care of you as well. So befriending that frustration, that rage, that need to be perfect, thanking that voice inside for doing what it was supposed to do, but now taking responsibility. I almost said control. Taking responsibility as an adult. These are ways we're threatened by those inner wild beasts that really often do not mean any harm. If we feel a certain emotion, usually often referred to as a negative emotion, but I prefer a dark emotion instead of putting a judgment of negative on it. Some emotion like anger, grief, or fear, we think it threatens our tranquility. We may choose to try to stifle this feeling in order to regain that illusion of control. But you know, it's only an illusion. If the feeling is not dealt with, the feeling or feelings will come out in other ways, either by yelling at somebody or shaming somebody else or just outright being mean. Those feelings will come out in some way. And the truth is that we need our feelings, even those dark ones, to stay fully human. They are God-given. And that's something people have difficulty understanding sometimes, that anger, frustration, fear, confusion, these are God-given emotions to teach us how to live life more fully. When we recognize that that stuff's going on in our lives, how we can do it differently and find that peace that passes understanding. Emotions, even what we consider to be those dark, threatening ones, are forms of internal energy. And instead of muting our emotions, we can befriend them, listen to their counsel, and channel their energy for our benefit. When we picture Jesus sitting with the wild beasts, can we see him communing with them and not trying to change their wildness? Our task with our emotions is to ask questions like, if I feel angry, what do I need to learn from my anger? If I'm sad, what is my sadness teaching me about me? Ask and see what the responses are. Sit quietly, maybe journal, try painting or coloring those emotions and see what happens. I remember one time taking a paintbrush in hand and I painted splotches of paint on a plain piece of paper, and they were different colors, and each color represented a different person in my family. And then for some reason I dipped my paintbrush in the black and painted all over it so that I couldn't see any of the color, because that's how I was feeling at the time, very isolated and alone and in the dark. And then I tried it again several weeks later, and I put those splotches of color on the paper, each color representing a certain person in my life, and I still painted black on it, but just a little bit. And I could see that there'd been some movement in my own emotions, my own feelings, my own understanding of myself. So there are many different ways that we can get in touch with these emotions, these wild beasts that occur within us. In the wilderness, temptations and wild beasts tend to take the center stage. They make the place what it is, disconcerting, difficult, and fearful. With temptations and wild beasts dancing all around us, it's easy to miss the presence and the care of angels. We all need care in the wilderness, just as Jesus did. So I invite you to think about, who are the angels in your life? Who's been there when you've needed someone? Maybe even before you knew you needed them. I remember hearing about a grieving family. They had lost their daughter in a car accident, and a friend came over to offer condolences, and the family just couldn't see this person right now. So this friend went back and sat in her car and sat there all night praying for that family. Can you imagine how much it meant to that family the next morning realizing that that person had sat out there all night praying for them. I remember another grieving family. A friend came over and polished all of their shoes. Back when we polished shoes, polished every pair of shoes before the funeral, knowing that that family wasn't going to have the energy to polish shoes before the funeral. There are people there before we even know we need them sometimes. One time I sent a note to a woman, an affirming note, an encouraging note, I thought it was, and she called me a few days later and said, Billie, I got that note on the very day that I lost my job. And to come home, to be affirmed in that way, helped ease the desperation I was feeling in having lost my job. So we never know for sure what it is we do, how we might be an angel to someone else. Angels in the wilderness may come in unexpected forms, and they may not be all sugary sweetness. They may be the sibling who chastises us, saying we need to spend more time with mom and dad, or the police officer who pulls us over for unsafe driving because we're texting and driving and carelessly moving into the other lane. An angel may be a coach or a boss or a spouse or even a stranger who says just the thing we need to hear to shake us out of our self-absorption. Yes, the angels say and do what we need for our care. And sometimes angels are not people. Sometimes we find healing or hope in a song or a book, maybe a movie or a TV show, or the unconditional love of a pet. So I ask, are you able to receive the help of angels in your life? We can easily forget in the midst of what feels like a fight for survival that there are angels in our lives. I invite you this week and throughout Lent to watch for bits of saving grace in the midst of any difficulties that you have. They are there, surprising and usually unexpected. We can count on them to appear and reappear as needed. None of us is alone in a Lenten wilderness. I read about a church recently that chose as its Lenten theme 40 Days of Love. Each week, members of the congregation were encouraged to show their love and appreciation in different ways. The first week, they were invited to send notes to people who had made positive contributions to their lives, their angels, so to speak. After the service, a macho-looking, self-made kind of man in the congregation walked up to the front of the church to tell his pastor, I love you and I love this church, but I'm not going to participate in this 40 Days of Love stuff. It's okay for some folks, but it's a little too sentimental and syrupy for me. The week went by, and on Sunday, this man waited again after church to see his pastor. I want to apologize for what I said last Sunday, about the 40 Days of Love. I realized on Wednesday that I was wrong. Wednesday, his pastor repeated. What happened on Wednesday? I got one of those letters, the man said. The letter came as a total surprise. It was from a person I never expected to hear from. And it touched me so deeply that I now carry this letter around in my pocket all the time. And every time I read it, I get tears in my eyes. It was a transforming moment in this man's life. Suddenly he realized he was loved by others in his church. This changed his entire outlook. I was so moved by that letter, he said, I sat down and wrote 10 letters myself. Receiving that letter was a transforming experience for Mr. Macho. It came from a mailbox rather than a wilderness, but the effect was the same. He recognized the angels in his life. So I invite each one of you and me this week to write at least one letter to one of those angels in your life. And yes, I'm saying this to any macho men or self-made women in the congregation. I invite you to recognize these folks as a part of the amazing grace God has built into your life. And then tell somebody what you did. Your spouse, a friend, the pastor, about the experience of writing that letter. Actually, in your bulletin, you'll find the 40 days. I can't find it right now. The 40 days of love. Here it is. Oh, 7 weeks of love. And I started a week late. This would have started actually last Sunday, but I didn't think about it until this one. So it goes on through the week of Easter. So I invite you to just keep this in hand over the 7 weeks of Lent and find something in here. No, not find something. Try to do each one of these suggestions every week. Writing a letter, telephoning somebody, giving something you've made to someone. Let someone know that they're in your prayers. Read 1 Corinthians 13 and replace the word love with your name. Cheer somebody up by visiting them. And then reflect on that last week of Jesus' life and the celebration of his resurrection. So this is a guide, if you don't have one already, for the Lenten season. The Spirit immediately drove Jesus into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. The 40 days of Lent, in part, remind us of the 40 days Jesus spent in the wilderness, facing his temptations, perhaps his crazy thoughts, paying attention to the wild beasts and to the angels, preparing him to go out into the world with a new focus, with the intent of interacting with the world and sharing God's amazing grace with others in a new way. May we do the same. Amen.